And we are recording. Welcome, Roy. Great to see you today.
Thank you.
I'm just so looking forward to chatting to you about our upcoming yoga trails in 𝗛𝗏𝗏𝗵𝗁𝗁 wilderness area. And I thought it might be nice to start with just asking you about your bushveld experience. I know that you've been working in Hluhluwe-iMfolozi for 10 years, but there's so much more to your wilderness experience.
Yeah, well, connecting with the wild and with wilderness, which aren't necessarily the same, has been a lifelong passion. And so before, I guess I'll work backwards. So I've worked in 𝗛𝗏𝗏𝗵𝗁𝗁 seasonally for about 10 years. But during that time, I've also worked in wild places in the Karoo, in the Snuwberg Mountains, near 𝗽𝗿𝗿𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗁, and in the Cederberg and the Drakensberg, and on Table Mountain, which has certainly got its wild corners. So those have been sort of the South African wild places that I've worked in. And then also during this decade, I've spent time with some very traditional hunter-gatherer groups, or as traditional as you can now find anyhow, in the bush in Tanzania, near Lake Eyasi, and in the Congo Basin forests in Gabon, which are wet and watery in the areas where we were, and also in the Kalahari. But before that, I had the privilege of spending some time with the hill tribes in Laos, in the rainforests, not far from the Mekong River. And was it the Mekong River? I think it was. I'm forgetting now.
A long time ago.
It was a long time ago. And in the mountains on the border with Burma or Myanmar as well. And then before that, I was living in the US for 5 years and was living on the edge of an amazing natural space that incorporates wilderness, but also some sort of logging land that's semi-wild, where forests are regenerating after a couple of rounds of logging. And that was in the Pacific Northwest, not that far inland from Seattle, where it was amazing. We could step across the road from where our house was into wild space that you could literally walk more or less under tree canopy all the way into Canada, or all the way south, where the trees thinned, and you'd had to cross a few highways, but you could get most of the way to Mexico along the mountain chains. So, and that all these wild places have been particularly special to me because I grew up in England, which doesn't have wilderness, more or less at all.
Are you allowed to say that?
Well, I thought about it carefully as I said it. It's got some wildness, but no wilderness in the sense that there's almost no land at all in the British Isles that hasn't been either ploughed at some point or under sheep.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's I think something that's always struck me about the way you live, but also the work you do, is you very much focus on nature connection for yourself, but also as a facilitator for the groups that you work with. I'm interested to hear how was that always how it was for you? Or did it come about through learning and then feeling a need to go deeper?
I think, well, let me start by mentioning my relationship with the word beauty. So when I was small, when people would say, oh, that's a beautiful city or a beautiful house or a beautiful woman, I had no idea what they were talking about, why one woman or city or house was more beautiful than another, or even what beauty really meant. And I remember the moment where I had my first kind of breathtaking experience of natural beauty, and I suddenly understood what beauty was, which was at a sunset with a tree in the back garden silhouetted against a beautiful sky and English blackbirds singing. Very simple, very ordinary in a way, but something transcendent happened in that moment for me. Or transcendent might not even be the word, because that suggests leaving something behind, but something unifying. And my passions when I was a child and teenager were to do with the sort of naturalist approach to being with nature. So bird watching, wildlife watching, understanding plants, medicinal and edible plants. So there was a sort of a strong knowledge component to it, but I realized, I think quite early, that it wasn't really about the knowledge. It was about the feeling and about the sense of closeness, of kind of intimacy with the land and with natural beings, a sense of companionship and kinship. And so when I studied natural geography and biology academically, I wasn't getting what I was looking for. I was getting knowledge, but it was disconnected and didn't create connection. So then it was after my master's degree when I went and studied at the Wilderness Awareness School and also at Tom Brown's Tracker School in North America. And they had this phrase, nature connection. So then I sort of met a community and a philosophy that incorporated a scientific naturalist approach with experiential ecology, in which the experiencer was an important part of what we were exploring. And a kind of an approach that went beyond eco-psychology, which often tends to emphasize the psyche more than the ecology. The nature connection and especially John Young's deep nature connection approach was an amazing way to really bring it all together into something that felt unified and properly holistic.
Sure. Your comment about beauty really resonated, because I've often been with people, maybe in driving through the countryside, thinking of the winelands here in the Cape, for example, and people will say it's so beautiful. And I've always, since I was a child, felt that it was quite manufactured. So I found it pretty, but I never quite understood why I couldn't connect with it in the way that others were, my fellow travelers or family or parents. And I later realized it was because I was missing the wildness in the scene. Yes, it was very pretty, but it was very controlled. And that thing that was missing was a wild element, an element not tampered with by humans.
Yeah, and for me, there's something very interesting there about what wildness is and why it draws so many of us. And my favorite verbal definition of wildness is from an author called J. Griffiths, who wrote a book called Wild. And she says, what is wild is self-willed. So it's a positive definition of this idea of something that escapes control or that isn't tampered with. Both of those are negative definitions based on what we don't do to something. But the positive definition is about something that's fully able to be itself, to spontaneously do what it feels it needs to, whether it's a plant or an animal or a weather system or a river, and to express itself to its fullest within its context. And there's something that you can see in the human spirit where a person isn't internally or externally oppressed when they're showing themselves in a flourishing, spontaneous way that is appealing to us inherently, I think, because some part of us echoes with that, resonates with that.
I love that more positive framework, because I think also the idea of an absence, or of, as you said, people not tampering, it often puts us as the negative, the human itself, the oppressor, And I know, I mean, if you love nature and wilderness, you're inclined to feel angry with what our own species is doing. But I sometimes wonder how helpful it is to always see us as bad in simplistic terms, rather than as potentially a very positive part of the natural world.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I think we make a mistake so often, because we assume that our culture is representative of human nature, and it's not. It's a particular culture and set of cultural assumptions that mean that we have this unfortunate destructive relationship with the non-human world. And there are lots of examples of cultures that have a more harmonious relationship with nature, and a more sustainably harmonious relationship with nature that's lasted for thousands of years, or perhaps even longer. And I've been lucky enough to spend time with some of those, or the remnants of some of those cultures, and their attitudes towards things are so different. And the result of that is that, for me, it's not about humans being bad, it's about our culture. And that's something that the more we become conscious of, the more we can change if we choose to. And I think so many of us are longing for that, for more connection, really, and a more harmonious connection with ourselves, with each other, and with the wild earth.
Yeah.
And that supports the health of all three.
Absolutely. And I guess this talk of culture also allows for a systemic change, as opposed to feeling overwhelmed as an individual. I think something where I connected with you initially, way back when I met you, I don't even know when that was, is you seem to share, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem to share kind of bewilderment sometimes at how the world does operate with respect to nature. And I've always felt that since I was a child, but I was told I was sweet, sensitive, a girl, don't know how the world actually works. And more I'm seeing through meeting people like you and others who I meet through going to the bush or doing work that we're going to be doing. I'm seeing more and more this longing that you've described, that there are many of us who want this. Even if we're not entirely sure what it involves, or what it will look like, or what we need to let go of, how hard it might be or easy, there is definitely a sense of community that might perhaps become a new and fresh kind of culture in time.
Well, let's hope so.
Yeah. Let's hope so. So I wanted to, in fact, how did we meet? I think we met through.
I was just wondering about that. I remember, I think we had already met when you came to the Embodying Earth Nature Connection walks that I was doing in Orange Cliff.
Yes, we had met
in Cape Town.
That's right, but I think I got to know you better. In fact, I think we met randomly through a work setup, through able, most likely.
I think so, yeah, through mountain guiding.
And then I came on that really incredible nature connection work you did. In fact, I wanted to ask you about it because obviously with my interest in yoga, meditation is a key part of that. And I've always struggled with meditation in a more traditional sense. But that's a story for another day. But what I loved and still do is the sit spot that you introduced us on the course. And I actually did it just before I came on camera. I woke up feeling a bit agitated, maybe got allergies, not feeling so well, and realized that would be so helpful. And I haven't done it for a long time, but I went today and I chose a spot. I'm even going to label it, I think, Renata's sit spot, write it up on a little stone. And I just sat there for 10-15 minutes, and that works for me. So I wondered if you could share a little more for people who don't know about the sit spot, what it means to you and how to go about it.
Yeah, well, there are sort of two things that you mentioned there that we might differentiate, but that are also connected. And the one is your relationship to meditation and how that connects with sit spot practices. And the other is the relationship with the sit spot itself.
Mm-hmm.
So there's actually, this is something I need to investigate further because I haven't found yet evidence of whether this is true, but there's someone I know who's actually a traditional healer, a sangoma, who says that meditation, especially the way that it arose in the Far East, was a civilizational response to the loss of the kind of awareness that is easily accessible to people who are living as hunters and gatherers. Mm. And I think there's a whole load more to it than that, but that's one possibility. And there's actually an amazing film made by a television personality called Bruce Parry, who's an expedition leader and made some amazing series about connecting with indigenous people. And he's recently, or a couple of years ago, made a film called 𝗽𝗿𝗁, which is looking specifically at this question of what is the awareness and the kind of the state of inner quiet that traditional hunters, in this context, a couple of different rainforest cultures that they have, and how can we try to access that and sort of quieten our busy Western thinking minds. And he connects that with Eastern meditation practices. But I think there's some fundamental differences there. And one of them is that when your awareness focus is on what's happening in the natural world around you, you don't run the risk of becoming disconnected. Whereas if your awareness focus is only on, say, your breath or your internal experience, as many of the Eastern traditions suggest you should practice, then I think there's a real risk of ecological disconnection and alienation that can still take place. So yeah, so some of the meditation practices associated with the nature connection lineage that I was trained in incorporate what we call a sense meditation, which is very simple. And it's where you run your awareness through each of your senses, your 5, maybe your 6, if you include your proprioception or your sense of what is going on inside your body as well. And that has the effect of also quietening the mind and bringing you into presence and bringing you into a sense of connection with what's likely to be the natural world around you if you're doing this outdoors. And the sit spot, the concept, I think, has its roots in some traditional Native American mentoring practices, awareness mentoring. And the concept came from the lineage now best represented by Tom Brown Jr. And from his teachers, and is very well expressed by John Young, who is in the same lineage, who started the Wilderness Awareness School. And its basic idea is that one of the best ways to get to know nature and to be connected with it is to have a personal, intimate relationship with one place on earth, one spot. Mm-hmm. And that spot might be a small area, perhaps like 100 meters wide, that you would study really well, but that it's centered on the particular place where you put your buttocks and sit. So that's why it's called the sit spot. So it becomes a place where you can meditate, and where you can study nature. And the nature connection practices that John Young teaches through the Kamana naturalist training program, for example, are all about the combination of developing your observational awareness through your senses, the quiet mind, which is also comes from traditional Native American teachings, and your understanding of the ecological processes around you. And there are beautiful kind of interrelationships and echoes and flows between the internal and the external or so-called external experience through a sit spot practice. Because, for example, there's a concept that in the nature connection world we call baseline, or the baseline symphony, which is often best represented through bird sound. But it's the state where the animals and birds are relaxed. So they're socializing, they're feeding, maybe they're preening, drinking, doing ordinary things that they wouldn't do when they're in an alarmed state of agitation or of fear. And typically what happens when modern humans experience nature is we disturb it. So the birds fly away, we disturb the animals, they run away. And if they stand still, then they're often frozen in a kind of a fear-aroused state. So we often never actually experience nature in its relaxed state, in its baseline state, which is often the same in terms of our own experience of ourselves, that we're often in a flustered, sort of fast-paced thinking, productivity-oriented, stressful mind state. So the nature connection process of getting to know a sit spot incorporates awareness practices so that you can calm yourself. And also just the act of keeping still in one place for usually about 20 minutes or more means that the birds in particular, or other animals if you're lucky enough to live in a place where you can see them, that they'll also start to relax back to their baseline state. And you'll be able to observe them, relate to them in a relaxed way where they're able to be themselves and show their natural intelligence. Nobody's intelligent when they're in a panic. And so it's quite radically different than most people's everyday experience of being out walking their dogs, let's say.
I love how, because we talk often of presence in yoga and meditation in nature, but I love how this is a kind of presence that is not just about the self. It's presence of all. If, as you say, you allow it to come to that point where all can be present. I find that really beautiful. And I think what I love about the sit spot is this quietness that we're talking about, both for ourselves and for whatever is around us, is accessible.
Very accessible.
Yeah.
It's something that's natural to all of us.
And possibly that's why I've found it more helpful than my usual approach to meditation, which may be my own fault, trying to achieve some kind of state that I'm just not feeling. But then having been aware of that stillness in other times of my life or just during the day, without having done a meditative practice, it just can come.
Yeah. So there's something natural about what happens through our senses to our awareness if we put ourselves in resonance with the natural world rather than the constructed world of suburban and urban landscapes. And I think I'm not exactly sure what that is. It's a mystery, but there's somehow we in our internal experience start to echo what's happening around us. There's a neuronal system in our nervous systems called the mirror neuron system. I don't know exactly how it works, but what one of its features is that we internally mimic what we see around us, or echo what we see around us. And I have a hunch that there's something in this self-willed aspect of wild beings, of natural beings, where they're just being themselves. If we witness that through our senses, just by being outside and paying attention in a gentle way, then some of that happens in us. And so there's a tacit relating already happening through that. And it's kind of an opposite trajectory to the civilized busy mind. It's something that calms us, that promotes our health. And there are all sorts of studies to show that awareness in natural spaces, mindfulness in natural spaces promotes health, often within a very short period. I don't know if you've come across the studies of what they're calling forest bathing.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes.
So from
the name.
one or go on.
The name has me in a state of bliss.
Yeah. So they did blood tests before and after a 1 or 2 hour period of mindful walking in different environments. They tested people who walked in an urban environment, in an urban park, and in a natural forest. And they found that there was very little difference between the urban and the park environment in terms of the impact on people's measurable health statistics that they looked at, but the natural forest had a big impact. And they were looking in particular at hormone indicators of stress. Cortisol was one of them, the long-term stress hormone. That declined through exposure to the natural environment. And they looked at other indicators as well to do with immune system strength. Certain cells, immune cells, were higher in the people who'd been walking in a natural environment. And if I remember the study correctly, this was after a single 1 or 2 hour exposure.
Sure.
So there's measurable, sort of objectively measurable indicators that being in nature is good for us. But of course, more important than that, perhaps, is our experience of it, how we feel and what happens in our awareness.
Yeah.
And there's something spontaneous in that. That's what's interesting. When we sit down to meditate in an indoor context, we're having to do it deliberately and with intention and focus and sometimes effort. And if we just go outside and sit, something happens spontaneously for many people.
Yeah.
And the longer we spend in a wild space, if we go to a deep wild space for several days, then that state just tends to deepen.
Yeah. Which feels like a natural sort of segue into the upcoming yoga trails that we'll be running. Yeah, very exciting initiative. And I wonder, maybe for those who've never been on a wilderness trail and are not entirely sure what that means, maybe you could give some kind of description of a typical day, if a typical day even exists.
So I guide what we call trails, wilderness trails, in 𝗛𝗶𝗴𝗵𝗵𝗁𝗁 Game Reserve, or the 𝗛𝗶𝗴𝗵𝗵𝗁𝗁 Wilderness in northern KZN. And it's probably the closest that most people will ever get to being in nature, or the closest they'll ever get to an immersion in nature. So we go typically for 5 days, and we go to a large area of wilderness. And wilderness is a place where the full range of natural processes are intact, where large animals have enough space to be themselves, where the land isn't managed, and where there is little or no human impact, no signs of humans.
And I think
so the area there is about 45,000 hectares of wilderness, as a part of a 100,000 hectare protected area.
I think sometimes that's not 100% clear to people, that where these trails are run is an area that has been put aside. So a lot of people might know of Hluhluwe-iMfolozi and go and do game drives, go do self-safari there. But this area we're talking about is an area dedicated to wilderness.
Exactly.
Which is very different to your usual self-drive safari or lodge experience.
Yeah, so this is a fairly vast area where there aren't any roads. No roads, no buildings, no signs of any human involvement. And in fact, it's one of the oldest protected areas, if not the oldest, in all of Africa. It was protected before the colonial administration was responsible for the area. So in King Shaka's time, in the 1830s, the area was considered sacred, and King Shaka moved the people who were currently living there, because there were a few homesteaders there grazing their cows among all the animals. And he actually displaced those families and set it aside as his royal hunting grounds. This was the area between the White Umfolozi and the Black Umfolozi rivers. And the royal hunting grounds doesn't sound like a conservation move until you understand that he only hunted once a year there. And the rest of the time, the land was left to be itself. And the only humans who he permitted to go there were blacksmiths, because there was a good source of iron ore, and which was mostly for his military efforts for making spearheads, and the herbalists who went there because the area was considered to have a special medicinal energy in their understanding. So medicinal herbs were collected there. So it was protected from that point, and its protection continued through the colonial administration, not always in ways that we would think of as acceptable now, because the area was expanded and some Zulus were cleared from that area. And so, the process of exclusion and sort of apartheid type policies were happening in the greater Umfolozi region long before apartheid was officially instated. But what happened then is that this sort of colonial idea of wilderness that excluded people meant that a pretty large area was set aside and protected. And the wilderness designation happened quite early, I think in the 1940s and 50s, which meant that that area was protected from having any roads or any lodges built on it. And there were various historical happenings to do with the land management that kind of were little bumps on the way, but the wilderness is that designation, that level of designation of protection is the highest. So the rest of Umfolozi, Hluhluwe, the animals may not know the difference, but it's divided by roads, pylons, staff accommodation, aerials, lights, lodges, and so on. But the wilderness isn't. So it's remarkable. It's like stepping back in time to an era before humans were the dominant force on the landscape. And so what we do is we drive to where the last road is, and we get out of the vehicle there with everything that we need in our backpacks, and we just walk into the bush.
Amazing.
And then it's almost like we disappear into another world. And it's truly a world that is still enchanted.
I remember the first time I did the trail as a participant, as a trailist, just being so struck by this deep sense of place. I don't know if I had ever experienced that before. And I say that as someone who's traveled a lot to the bush and has always loved the bush. It does seem to be my particular landscape. But just something different. As you say, like walking into another world.
There is something particularly powerful about the Umfolozi area. And it's like every place, like every person has its unique personality, and some people have a particular presence, and Umfolozi is like that. There's something special that you can feel there that kind of makes you wonder if you're feeling the same thing that the Zulus did when they decided that only the herbalists would be able to go there because it had a special energy.
Mm.
I don't know if I'm feeling the same thing. But it's a world where we don't make the rules for once, because there are things bigger than us that live there, and we share the space with them.
Yeah.
So rather than us doing exactly as we think, as we please, as we think we should be entitled to, instead we fit into a pattern that pre-exists us and what we think ought to happen. So not many people ever get to experience that. And there aren't many places in the world where that can still be the case, because much of the world has lost its megafauna. So it's a very archetypally powerful experience, and something that's very hard to express in words in an interview like this. And you sort of have to be there to know it.
Mm. I get a real sense of the magic, though, from how you're describing it. I wonder, shall we chat a bit about the kind of more practical side of the trail? That the idea that, for example, we are not allowed to use phones. It's a complete digital detox.
Yeah. So this is something that
shuffling off all these things, placing them in a safe, if I remember correctly, and then walking in there with a pack and not much else.
Yeah. So the organization that started doing trails in the 𝗛𝗶𝗴𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗁𝘁𝘀 wilderness started in the 1950s. And in those days, the concept of digital detox would have been meaningless. But as we've developed more and more devices over the years, I mean, everything ranging from torches to all the way to mobile phones, you know, cameras even weren't very common in the 1950s. So we've tried to keep the experience as pure and powerful as possible. And part of what that means is that we want to actually create a threshold between the civilized world and the experience in the bush. If we take all of the civilized contraptions with us, we don't leave civilized mind. We never get to experience wildness. Not really. So we don't allow people to take any timepiece, for example, a watch, or a mobile phone, or any device, except we do permit cameras and torches, because we need them. We need the torches, and the camera is really nice. But other kinds of gadgets, we leave them all behind. And people struggle with that. People don't want to leave their phones behind, especially. As it is, reception there is very patchy, and also there's a tremendous risk of rhino poaching being supported by people using their phones, and it's actually illegal under the regulations of the 𝗽𝗿𝗿𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗁 Wildlife Administration. So we're not allowed to take mobile phones on trails. But it has this beautiful consequence of digital detox. And of what that ultimately does is, apart from breaking the addictive pattern of scrolling, it allows people's eyes to refocus on what our eyes were evolved for. And it means that we can really move into being in the present moment. We're not distracted, we're present. And strangely, that's become one of the most radical aspects of going into the bush in this way. And then, yes, so we take the minimum because we carry it on our backs. Yeah. So the less we carry, the nicer it is. But obviously there are things we need. So the lifestyle is one of, we don't try to get somewhere. We don't try to move very far. It's not about this mindset of getting from A to B. It's about being where we are. So we walk as far as we need to. And if it's too hot, we don't walk much. And we move from place to place. So we camp along the river in the most protected spots, and we sleep out under the stars unless it's raining. So we have a continual contact with the world around us, coming directly through our senses. So it's truly an immersion. And we are able to have an open fire from collecting very specific dead wood in such a way that we don't cause much impact. And we live in a way that leaves no trace. You can't tell that the fire was even there when we leave. And the only things we take from the landscape are the wood and water from the river, which we boil to make sure that it's safe to drink. And then we move to a different camping place a few times. So the experience really mimics the pattern of how our distant ancestors would have once lived on the wild landscape. The only difference being that we don't hunt or gather for our food because we don't have the skills for that anymore.
Yeah.
And it's also not permitted in the wilderness area.
Yeah.
So we bring in our food and we bring in our shelter. And other than that, we're nakedly in the wild.
I think what I'm being reminded of is the spontaneity of the experience, which is also what you mentioned around the sit spot. Of course, the guides have an idea in their minds, but the rest of us all of us actually are left to be spontaneous. So I recall on the trail that I first went on, which wasn't with you, we circled back to a camp we'd been to already because we'd spotted a pride of lions, a rhino on the other side of the riverbank, and the feeling was, let's follow our curiosity, and that's what we did. So there was no sense of we must go further. No, we turned back and went back to where we'd been. And I think we actually slept 2 nights in one spot, which hadn't necessarily been a plan. It's just how it unfolded. And that act of following our curiosity was so rewarding as a process, but also what it revealed, the things we saw as a result of following that curiosity was so incredibly rewarding as well. And I felt
so
like
this is
forgotten how to be like that.
Yes.
Childlike curiosity, and having also the confidence to follow it and see where it goes, and the trust.
Yeah. And those attitudes are kind of in opposition to ideas of planning and control. And so much of our world is oriented around planning and control, our modern world. But if you're in a real wilderness, then there's a lot that's not in your control. That comes back to our definition of wildness, right? That which escapes control, that which is uncontrollable, or that which has its own will that it can express, and that doesn't necessarily cooperate with yours. So part of being in the wilderness is dancing with the unknown and having to change our ideas that we might have about a plan. So we can have an intention, but the bush has its say as well.
Yeah.
And that often means that we change route because there's a herd of buffalo, or because there's an elephant, or we don't walk as far as we intended, or we have to leave later or sooner because it's too hot or too cold, or the weather changes, or all of these things bring us into a sense of humility and presence and take us away from this idea that we can preconceive everything that's going to happen and plan and control accordingly. So, I mean, they're quite radical teachings to the Western mind, but stuff that is so natural, so actually intuitive, that we resonate with it and we come out of the experience feeling like something tremendous has happened inside us.
I'm curious to know, as someone who does this often, because for many people it's more an entry point. You go and have an experience like this, it's a one-off, profoundly affected by it, and then you come back to normal life, try to bring in some of the tools, but maybe they fall away and you get swept back into normal life, as happens even after a holiday. As someone who does this often though, how has it changed you and how you live when you are back in suburban life, for example?
Well, it's an adjustment every time.
Yeah.
It is like coming between two worlds, and worlds where the rules or the patterns are very different. It can be disorienting, even for me, coming out of the wilderness or going back into it. There's an adjustment process each time. But what I come away with is a kind of a more open and questioning perspective on our modern world. A curiosity about how we could do things differently that might work better and might be more in tune actually with our own human natures. Because we force ourselves a lot in the modern world. We force ourselves into boxes, square pegs into round holes, humans into expectations of productivity that are inhuman, and they're inhumane as well, both perhaps to the human but also to the natural earth. So it gives me perspectives on those things. And it gives me a sense that what sits well with us is a good intuition about what's probably a good idea as a way to be and as a way to relate to the planet. And we get a clearer sense of that being in the bush, because all of the expectations of our culture are taken away for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. So I think now's probably a good point also to chat about the yoga aspect of the trail that will be
Yes.
running. So I mean, there are many reasons why I wanted to collaborate with you, and so many, too many to mention. But one thing that I've always been quite intrigued by is you've done a number of more unusual trail experiences, including with the Buddhist nun, is that correct?
Yeah.
So you seem to be very open also to different lenses through which to experience a wilderness trail.
Yeah. So, I mean, part of it is that every group brings or develops, if it's a group where all the members know each other, then you often come in to the experience of being in the bush with an existing group mind, an existing kind of culture. If it's a group where people are fresh together, they don't know each other, then it's easier to kind of form a group culture together when you go into the bush. But what I've noticed is that there are some things that can deepen the experience. And we've talked a little bit earlier about meditation and the relationship between that and nature awareness. So it was a natural fit to work with a Buddhist nun who understands a lot about the workings of the mind and the nature of the mind and how that fits with our meditation practices, but it also fits with our awareness of our surroundings. And yoga is also a natural fit. And you would, as a yoga teacher, you would know more about that and you might be able to express some of it. But, you know, from the basic understanding that I have, it's a set of practices that came out of an ancient culture that was much closer to nature than we are. And many of the postures are named after animals and animals' movements. And it was something that people would often do early in the morning outside. Even the almost stereotyped practice of greeting the sun would have been literal at one point. And so when those kinds of cultural practices arose out of a direct experience with nature, then to place them back in the wilderness again in a group setting means that both the yoga and the experience of wilderness deepen and connect together, of course. And I think potentially give the group several rungs deeper experience than might spontaneously happen.
Yes, and I think there's also, well, for me anyway, as a yoga practitioner and teacher, a great access point for me for presence is through my body. And that's not necessarily true for everyone, but I think that with the right kind of support and exposure, it can become more and more natural and intuitive. And you know, the yoga studios today, I'm so glad they're around, that they have enabled this amazing art with science to it, to come into our more modern urban lives. But I've always felt a longing to practice outside, to move outside. So I love to go to my favorite studio, but I wanted to embody more what was around me, and also have yoga be not such a solo, almost insular experience sometimes, to have it be a part of the environment, and to have it even express the environment. So you know this already, but I sometimes practice yoga in a way that is inspired by the bush. So I create postures out of what I see, you know, a particular tree shape, or I've worked with kids using African, mostly rhino and elephant shapes to explain to them, you know, how a white rhino might graze and the black rhino will browse, using shapes. So it's also a wonderful way to also come to understand yourself in nature, but also the nature around you.
Fantastic. And I love the playful attitude that you're bringing into it there.
And that's just,
and the spontaneity.
Yes, that's just what I was going to say now. It's something I maybe hadn't focused on yet, is the level of play and fun, as well as the deep introspection and the reflection and the embodiment. And I see, in terms of the yoga trail, or the yoga trails that we are running, I see the yoga very much as complementary to the trail. I remember when we first spoke, this was something that we honed in on. I think you in fact said it is very much about the wilderness experience, and the yoga is there to work with it. So we will, you know, no one should expect a strong vinyasa class. We'll do yoga that is responsive to our needs, our energy levels, to the temperature, to the terrain. We're not always going to find nice flat spots. We're going to be working with river sand, maybe in amongst bush. We're going to be interrupted by nature occasionally, I'm sure. Yeah, so this idea of yoga being union, I think this union, bringing the yoga into the bush, and for me, it's bringing yoga home in a way that I understand, and that resonates with me, and that I feel very inspired to share with people. That's really how I see this wilderness aspect of the trail and the yoga coming together.
Beautiful. And for me, there's something that becomes kind of dogmatic or fixed quite often about practices that leave their original context and their original, the sort of the nest they grew up in. So meditation, if it comes out of nature and becomes in a room, can become fixed and dogmatic. The same can happen with anything, including yoga. And so there's an excitement of the need for flexibility and adaptivity and responsiveness and playfulness that you're talking about there, when you put yoga in a more natural setting again. We're used to doing yoga on flat surfaces in rooms where we can remain in control. And in the bush, we're not the only factor. So yoga becomes actually more deeply relational, not isolated, like you're saying. It becomes relational again, because we're relating constantly to something that has its own will. And that's very exciting for me to be part of almost I was going to say the evolution of yoga, but almost like the remembering of yoga.
Yeah, it's really exciting. It really is. Thank you so much for our chat today. Any final comments?
My pleasure.
Anything you'd like to add?
just so I think
we lost
I think I lost me there. You missed my most profound comment. So. But I can't say it again.
No, lost the moment. Sorry. Try again.
No, just a willingness to enter the unknown. So there's an element of daring in terms of coming on an experience like this. And that's even the case for me as an experienced guide, that I never know what's going to be there. Yeah. So there's an openness that's very exciting and very freeing in the attitude that we carry in ourselves towards entering an experience like this. That's a radical break from what we're used to.
I feel excited even more than I did before. Can't wait. Thanks, Roy.
Thank you too. All right. Bye.
Bye.